When you are operating portable, portable is a word that many hams today, because it isn't as obvious and it isn't mandatory in the same way that it used to. Portable is misunderstood. A lot of hams think they're walking around with their handy talkie, their little two-way handheld, that's portable. That's not what portable to the FCC means. Portable, by the FCC's definition, is when you're operating a station. It can be mobile or it can be stationary, but it's away uh, from your home location and really out of the area completely. For example, if I go out to my ranch in Wyoming, sit down at the station I have set up there, it's a fixed station, but it is not my home QTH. I properly should identify with the self-assigned indicator /W8, because that call zone is 7, call zone 7. And so if I'm going to operate there, so as not to confuse other hams, they are not going to get the great opportunity to work on 2 meters, a ham radio operator in Michigan, Ohio, or West Virginia. I just happen to be right here in the same neighborhood. I want to let them know /W8. Okay. We use the W prefix because it was the first ham prefix ever issued. So that's what we do. Now, it used to be a requirement you do that. It's not anymore. Okay. In your book, it says licensee or trustee. And what is the difference? Well, both trustees and regular licensees are licensees. But a trustee is a special form of licensee. If you have a ham radio club, then you can apply for a club license. Members of the club at the club's facilities or get-togethers can use that license, but they can only use their own privileges, unless, of course, someone else is willing to act as control operator for them. The person to whom the club license is issued is the trustee of that license. So, if you're operating in a repeater, repeaters have trustees. And if you're the trustee, you're the person responsible fundamentally for the repeater itself. But if you're operating through that repeater and you're not the trustee, then you are responsible for any mistakes you make, anything you do wrong on that repeater. But you're sharing a little bit of that responsibility is being shared by the trustee, because the trustee really should have a means to cut you off if you go hog crazy. Well, let's face reality. This is not like they're going to put you in jail if you make a mistake type of thing. And the FCC doesn't crack down on every minor violation. But technically, that's the law. Now, I think I covered on the air test. I told you that you should not test on the air unless you have to. And there are times when you must have to. So to begin with, if you're going to test on the air, first thing you do is transmit saying, is the frequency in use? Because if somebody comes back and says yes, you probably don't need to test on the air anymore. If nobody says anything, then you can continue with your test. When you're testing on the air, you want to be courteous. Keep it as short as possible, but you still must identify at the end of every when you're done, and identify you're done and give your call. And if you're testing for 10 minutes or longer, every 10 minutes you must identify. Generally speaking, hams test on the air to do things like tune the antennas or tune an amplifier, and it can be done as a rule well within 10 minutes. I always identify to start with and at the end and every 10 minutes in the middle. All right. The Q codes have two different definitions or two different Q codes for interference. There's QRN, or as many hams refer to as QR Nancy. QRN is caused by noise. It's interference from things like atmospheric thunderstorms, industrial or commercial equipment, welding operations, computers, you name it, anything that can make a noise, including LED light bulbs. Cheap LED screw-in light bulbs have they have unfiltered power supplies, and they can make RF noise. Generally
How,
speaking, if they're not too close to the antenna, it won't be a problem.
so as long as they're
Oh,
away from the antenna, you're fine.
some generally, but there's no steadfast rule that's always going to hold true.
Is there a
Okay.
distance you want to stay clear roughly, or?
Yeah, if you can be in the next state, it'd be really nice, but we don't get that option.
Okay.
No, there's no specific because one of the local hams here, he did a bang up job of testing um, LED light bulbs, and he was shocked to find out that they really do create a lot of noise. But generally speaking, if they're not too bad, I can give you one tip. They make a reduced noise type of LED screw-in light bulb made specifically for garage door openers.
Hmm.
They started discovering that LED light bulbs interfered with a remote control to your garage door openers. So they got smart, and some of the companies will sell you a supply with an actual or a bulb with an actually has a filter capacitor inside to reduce the RF output so that it less interferes with the remote garage door opener. But again, they're noisy. So one type we refer to is QRN, and that's natural noise in noise and environment. They may be man-made, but they're not intentionally made. The other type is QRM, and that's QR interference, man initiated with the way I would word it. So you can remember that N is for natural and M is for man. And it means that somebody is interfering with you. It's not necessarily um, intentional. It's not, it's not necessarily illegal. It's only illegal if you're intentionally interfering. But just as the book says, common sense tells you how to deal with this. When you have someone else interfering with you, especially if you've been on the air and you've been on it for a while, and you're the only guy on this frequency, you and the people you're talking to, and all of a sudden there's somebody out of clear blue sky and he's talking to somebody else on the same frequency. Sometimes that's just a changing of propagation conditions. And when he started, you weren't interfering with him either, but now you're both interfering with each other. Courteous and polite thing to do is to work things out. One of you move to another frequency, or if you're about ready to wrap it up, wrap it up. So keep in mind that you can never intentionally interfere with another station. If your interference is not intentional, well, you want to work things out so that you both, as soon as you become aware of it. And you just follow common sense and good neighbor practices. I'm going to jump ahead. There's a clause down here on my page 277. I really wish every ham paid attention to. It says human interference is not necessarily intentional. It may simply be due to receiver overload. Modern receivers are tremendously sensitive, but it's expected that too much of them will run but it's expecting too much of them to run at full sensitivity while rejecting strong signals nearby. That's another fact to point out. If you've got your radio set in its most sensitive so you can hear weak stations, you're also going to sometimes pick up close stations on the same band, but not on the same frequency. Fortunately, there you can reduce your IF and perhaps try using your RIT to shift the person a little bit. Use your filters and shift them one way or another. You might eliminate that. But if the person's that close, many modern radios have an attenuator. And the attenuator will reduce your sensitivity. That's what it's for. And in that case, it will almost definitely eliminate the interference. So it does mention that here. I just talked about using the bandpass and IF shift. I just talked about attenuation and your receiver's gain control, which is pretty much your volume. You can turn that down. Sometimes you hear less of the other person. You experiment, you play with a little bit. You can really tune in. By the way, one field day, one person observing field day said, you know, when you get on the air, you play with the radio's controls, and man, you make everything real clear, and the rest of them just put up with the noise. Well, that's experience of playing with a radio from time. It won't be as much of a problem on FM, but it will be something on sideband to deal with. And AM you get the same effect. Okay, third-party communication. This is important. Just talked to a friend of mine down in Mexico. I've known him since we were in college together, and he found out for the first time that I'm a ham radio operator. He lives in Mexico. He is not a ham radio operator. I suspect that at some point in time, he's going to want to know if I can communicate with him through another ham radio operator in Mexico. And the answer is no. Third-party communications has some very special rules. You may engage in third-party communications to any ham radio station in the United States or in any of the U.S. territories or aboard a vessel in international waters that is registered in the United States. But officially, hams are not allowed to communicate third-party communications with stations in other nations, stations in international waters on vessels registered to a foreign nation, another nation, unless the nation that the ham handling the other side of the third-party communication that ham's country has a pre-existing third-party agreement with the United States. There is a list of third-party agreements in your book. It's right here. Let me go back to it. There we go. This is our third-party agreement list. And you'll notice from the list, it gives you some really fine nations. And Antigua, Barbuda, I think that's how you say it. Argentina, Australia, Belize, Bolemia. But as we go down this list, you are not, oh, we now have one with Mexico. Lo and behold, I can talk to my buddy, third party in Mexico. I am mistaken. These are the countries. Oh, yeah, we got that when the Mexican earthquake was agreed to. Forgot about that. Gosh darn, I forgot. That's a long time ago. Anyways, since the United States has a third party agreement with Mexico, and I think we discussed this before, you can, any of the third party agreement states you may hold a third party communique with. You won't find, for example, even though you can talk to hams in Russia, I don't think we have a third party agreement with Russia, do we? P. Well, there would be QR, and here's the S's. No, we don't have a third party with Russia. That's pretty amazing. I would expect that. You can talk to hams in China, but we don't have a third party agreement with China. So you can't talk to other people in China. But interesting enough, Cuba does have a third party agreement with the United States. Even in emergencies, we cannot communicate third party traffic or let not to someone at our station talk to the ham or get information from another ham in another country that doesn't have a third party agreement. Did you have a question, Jeff?
Nope, I'm good.
Okay. Now I got to figure out where the cancellation point is on this. Oh, yeah, it's telling me I can go. Let's see. There we go. Okay, remote operation. I've covered this before. Repeaters, beacons, and other stations that the human control operator without a human control operator present are maybe remote control stations. That means that doesn't mean there's nobody in control. It means they're not at that specific station physically. They are operating maybe across phone lines or the internet, whatever, or even another frequency link. And control when the book explains the difference between remote and automatic operation, but I'll kind of just gloss it over for easy memory. Okay. An automatically controlled station is set up like a repeater, as an example, that it functions fully automatically. When a user wants to access the repeater, he keys up on the frequency and the repeater comes to life. Nobody's in full-time control of that station. We have automatic circuits, or usually now microcontrollers, controlling its operation. And the person in control of the repeater is whoever is using it at the time, technically. So there's no need for a full-time control operator just for the repeater. By the way, this was not true originally. Originally, we had to have somebody around the clock doing duty as the switchboard operator for the local repeaters. Remote control operation, as example, would be if you were getting on if you're going on the internet and you went through Echolink, connected to a station that allows you to operate that station across the internet through Echolink, and then you are running that station in remote control. So let's review the definitions that'll make this easier to understand. Local control is when the operator is physically present at the transmitter. It can be any type of station. It can be a handheld, but you're right there. The handheld is usually in your hand. Remote operation is the control point, or where the operator is. He's away from the station, but he adjusts and controls the station through some type of a control link, an interface, a device, an electrical path, if you will, that permits him to control that station. And an automatic station It runs completely under the control of devices like microprocessors and to ensure that it stays within the rules. For this reason, we have certain things on repeaters and beacons that we don't usually run into in uh, other stations, like automatic timeouts that will time out and reset the repeater and leave it off for a certain period of time. It automatically will identify right over you when if you're talking through the 10-minute point when it should be IDing. It's things like that. In fact, they will repeaters once they brought up, they will identify every 10 minutes or when they go down and go quiet, all automatically. You don't have to make it do that. It just does it. Now, I want you to pay attention to question T110 because it's important. Who is responsible if a repeater inadvertently transmits communications that violates FCC rules? Well, the answer to this is back in the rest of the question. Who is responsible if the repeater inadvertently retransmits? Well, that signal, that violation came from somebody. And that would be whoever is operating the repeater, because at that point in time, they're the control operator. The control operators are responsible for their own content if it violates the FCC rules. Repeater owners and trustees are responsible to install the necessary equipment to handle the automatic controls and everything that keeps it in compliance with the FCC. They're not responsible for the way you use it. The users are responsible for that. So whoever is the user at the time is the control operator at the time, and they are responsible. So does that answer that? I hope it does. So, okay, prohibited transmissions. This is a good one. First, there's 7 words that the late comedian, I'm thinking of his name. I can see his face. He used to say the 7 dirty words you weren't allowed to say on the air. Now, they're pretty close to right, by the way. The FCC has a number of things that it considers prohibited transmissions. First and foremost are unidentified transmissions. You've got to follow the rules of identification or you're in violation. Two on the list is false or deceptive transmissions intended to deceive people. You can't use your radio to deceive people. You can't give somebody else's call sign as your own. You can't use your radio in nefarious purposes like that. And you may never use your radio in the commission of another crime. That will get you real serious trouble. Now, another biggie that will get you in very serious trouble is false or distress or emergency signals. If you give a fake SOS or a fake emergency claim on the air, you are going to be in some serious hot water, and it doesn't just have to do with the rules and regulations of the FCC. Now, at the bottom of the list there, it says obscene or indecent speech. Well, avoid, and it says avoid topics and expletives. Yep, the 7 dirty words are really frowned upon by the FCC. Beyond that, discussing stuff that you wouldn't want a child or grandma to hear pretty much is the FCC's way of deciding what is decent and what isn't, what is obscene and what isn't. If it would be child abuse to talk like that in front of a child, it's illegal. So another for prohibited communications is business communications. All amateur communications are intended to be of a personal nature, meaning you're just talking for the fun of it. If you're talking to earn money, if you're talking to facilitate something that will make you or somebody else money, you're in violation of the FCC's amateur code. And yes, your license for that can be stripped. Um, you, you, there is an exception. An amateur radio station may, as a rule, talk and facilitate selling amateur radio equipment, trading or selling it on the air to another ham if it's not his regular business. You have an extra radio and you're talking to another guy. He says, if you know anybody that's got a XYZ radio, let me know because I'm looking to buy one. And I say to him, yeah, I've got an XYZ I don't use. You want to buy mine? That's perfectly legal. I recommend at that point, don't talk dollars and cents on the air for a couple of reasons. And if you do, you'll find out quickly that everything you talk about on the air, somebody will be listening in that you didn't know was there. And I got you, Jason, by the way. I forgot to mention that. And it will come back to haunt you for a couple of reasons. One, you don't want to get on the air and somebody turns it into a bidding game on the air. And that just upsets the first guy who was looking for an XYZ radio. By the way, I don't know that there's anything named an XYZ radio. That's why I picked that. So you can facilitate sales, any sales of amateur radio related equipment, ham to ham. You can trade and swap on the air as long as you don't do it as a routine thing. You start doing it every week and you hold the amateur radio swap net, that might raise some ears at the FCC because that could be interpreted possibly as a business. If you're every week getting just together to swap stuff on the air, that could start to look like a business. Another form of prohibited transportation or communications is you can't use your radio to broadcast. Broadcast by definition is a one-way transmission. Sometimes a two-way transmission can be a broadcast, but it's fairly hard to hit that point. It's generally a one-way transmission for the general public to hear or for anybody to listen to. It's not a communications between two stations. How is it possible to be part of a one-way or a two-way conversation? Well, here's the way. I'm talking to you and I say, hey, by the way, if there's anybody out there going down Interstate 27, I don't know where that is. There's an accident at Main Street and Miller, or in between Main Street and Miller. There's always a Main Street and Miller in every town. And I would go a different route. It may sound like a courteous thing to say. CBers might do it all the time, but they're not amateurs. They're not in the amateur radio service, and that is a form of broadcast. So we have an exception to that. We have several. One exception is we may broadcast in order to transmit Morse code practice. We may broadcast by sending out CQ. CQ is technically a broadcast. It's sent to anybody, but we're really trying to find other hams. So it's not really for the general public. So it's perfectly legal. And we may broadcast for the purpose of general amateur radio news. Your local club can hold a weekly net on the repeater and cover the day's events that that are significant to other hams. You may say things like propagation numbers, sunspot activity, because that's all ham related stuff. not generally just for the general public, but just for hams. So what's okay? Well, you can use a repeater autograph or to auto patch through a phone line. It's not usually done much anymore. And you could change a doctor's appointment because the individual ham does not economically benefit from that. And they'll kind of let that one slide. They probably won't let you slide if you call to order a pizza. They're not going to let that slide at all. You can talk about your ham radio swap and shop, your club events, things like that. That's perfectly legal. You can describe your business as part of a general conversation. Hey, what do you do for a living? Well, I work at, or I own my own business. We make left-handed widgets for right-handed people. Anyway, now what you can't do, you can't call up somebody like a client if you're a salesman or a business associate to make a appointment or to meet them for lunch on a business related lunch. You can call a friend who you're not having any business with for money. You can go to lunch with him, but it can't involve something that makes you money. You can't get on the air and sell things other than ham radio goods or ham radio related stuff. You can't get on the air and sell ham radio gear if that's your regular business and if you make your living by doing it. And you can't advertise your professional services. You can't say, I'm a lawyer, and if you want me, call 1-800-NICK, and I will handle all your legal needs. Thank gosh I'm not a lawyer. And I'm going to get back to the book. And I'm going to talk about something that many hams don't understand. It's called encrypted transmissions. All of our digital stuff, all our digital communications, and things like audio compression, digital compression, they're actually encryptions. But the FCC and most governments of the world frown upon encrypted transmissions. Generally, they're not permitted because nations of the world get really scared about ham radio operators sending stuff that nobody knows what's being sent. Kind of has a little bit of espionage concern to it, and more so. Now, we are permitted to use some encryption, so our digital communications follow protocols. As long as we're using the established protocols that are already approved and established, we're fine because they're not encryptions that deceive the rest of the world. And they're not intended to hide anything or obscure them. So that's perfectly fine. But take to heart that if you wish to develop a new protocol, you actually have to go through steps, file paperwork with the FCC, sometimes with the ITU, and get permission to experiment with that new protocol. And only when you have permission to do so can you do so for a limited period of time and then submit proof to the FCC why they should adopt this new protocol. And if they do, then we can all use it at that point. Otherwise, we cannot use encryptions that distort or obscure what's being transmitted, with two exceptions. One is to control spacecraft. In this case, they're usually talking about satellite. We do encrypt the signals. We don't want the general public or even other hams to mess with to command satellites in space like amateur satellites. So we have permission to do that. We can send encrypted controls and messages to satellites for the purpose of its control. Likewise, we can encrypt to operate things like remote control airplanes, boats, race cars, any such cool toy. We can encrypt to do that again because it's a remote control application. But general communications, we cannot. By the way, there's another exception to the broadcast rule. You can broadcast one-way communications. It's not really a broadcast, but you can transmit one-way communications for purposes of remote control, whether it's a satellite or other device. Now, here's some biggies. You're never allowed to retransmit commercially broadcasts, programming, other services, communications. You can't retransmit from other services to the ham radio service. You can describe them as a ham to another ham, but you cannot retransmit them. So, under what conditions, it's asked on T1D04, and I've covered this, but under what conditions may you transmit music? And the answer to this one is there's one exception. Generally, hams may not retransmit music. No, you cannot say, oh, it's just in the background when my radio is on in the car and I keyed the mic, I wasn't retransmitting. Yes, you are. And no, you can't. Why? Because it falls under that part I just covered it before this. You're retransmitting another service. Whether it's immediate or delayed, you're not allowed to do it. Okay? So keep that in mind. You're not allowed to retransmit music. So if you're driving a car and you want to answer somebody, turn the FM broadcast radio station off or down so low it can't be heard. When may an amateur transmit a signal in support of broadcasting, program production, news gathering, and the likes there? Well, you can't. We're not a news service. We're also not a religious service, and we're not an emergency service. We can't transmit one way to inform people of emergencies, to save their souls. We can talk about our religion. I don't advise it because it's not going to make you highly popular. I tend to avoid that. You can talk about politics, but you can't get on the air to have your transmission of your hatred for President Mugabe of the country of whatever. Well, that's not appropriate. And there's no excuse that allows us to broadcast, no matter what it is. So, now T1D07 it asks you, and I'm going to pull this one up. What types of amateur stations can automatically retransmit signals of other amateur stations? Well, that's essentially what a repeater does. And it falls under the rules of repeat. I guess it won't come up for me. Let me try this one. Nope. Oh, well. Oh, I know why. There we go. And the only time you can't retransmit another ham, this is a pretty tricky one. That's why I'm bringing it up. The answer here is B. When his language is prohibited language. Remember that. Oh, that's not the question, was it? But it is the one time you cannot retransmit someone else's another ham's signal. Likewise, it's not courteous and acceptable to retransmit with their without their permission or their objection. So what type of amateur can automatic when this one here. Oops. When may an amateur station transmit information in support of broadcast? Oh, I forgot that exception. The only one time that you can go ahead and get on the air as a ham and retransmit what's uh, in direct support of any other service is when the communications are directly related to the immediate safety of a human life or the protection of property. That means it has to be a true emergency. Right that second, you're going to save a life. Then the rules kind of fall to the side when it comes to saying you can't do this, you can't do that, but it doesn't fall aside completely. You can't go on another frequency outside the ham bands and transmit because it's an emergency. Just, hey, I can retune my radio and tune down on the police bands and tell the cops directly, hey, there's a guy bleeding to death. No, that's a violation. Why? Well, because all of our rules in all of this Part 97 apply only to the ham radio bands. They have no permission to make exceptions elsewhere. And they're different services. They have their rules, we have ours. So how does the FCC define broadcasting? I covered that. I covered broadcasting. I told you it's prohibited. You can't transmit music. You can't transmit entertainment type video. You can't transmit. Amateur radio is intended for communications. Yeah, we do fast scan TV, and we can look at the other ham on the other end. He can look at us and we can talk. We can't run a TV show or a comedy special on amateur radio. Although some of the operators sometimes come across that way, it's not intended. It shouldn't be intended. Now, we can joke, we can kid around, but we can't make a formal type broadcast type transmission. Another thing I want to point out, it's important. Should you ever be on the air and you're being filmed by a TV crew, they don't have the same restrictions we do. Keep that in mind. So they won't be aware of this. If you're on the air and you're talking to another ham and the local TV station's filming you, one thing you can't do is announce on the air to any of the other hams that there's a TV station filming you while they're filming. Your discussion that ends up on their transmission cannot make reference to their presence. That will keep you out of a lot of trouble because we can't be a part of their business through amateur radio. All right, chapter 9, and we're going to move through this chapter in the next hour, so I'm going to get started real quick. Safety is an important part. When we talk about working with electricity, ACs, and grounding and lightning protection, RF, managing RF currents, interference. We're going to go through all this stuff. Reducing exposure to RF is important, and it's a new portion of amateur radio. And then tower and antenna installation safety. Last thing you want to do is get killed putting up a tower, and hams do every year. Don't. The goal in life is to stay healthy and not get dead. Don't ever get dead if you can avoid it. Electrical safety. If you work on anything electrical, the rule of thumb is unplug it, disconnect it. If there's a means to lock it out, lock it out. while you're working on it. Certain testing requires that the circuit be live, in which case, good electronic technicians and all hams should know that special power supplies exist at their test stations so that they have a limited current that will flow out of that station, and it is isolated from 110 by an isolation transformer, or 220. It's isolated with a 220 isolation transformer to protect the ham from uh, uh, electrocution. Your goal is to mitigate exposure and risk, and risk reduction is important. Um, I want to tell you about one thing most hams overlook. In a lot of our equipment, especially old tube stuff, particularly old tube stuff, there can be very dangerous AC line currents in there, but there can also be very dangerous DC line currents. And before we go to break, I want to tell you why it's important. An AC signal once every 60 seconds, 60 times a second, I'm sorry, 1/60th of a second, every 60th of a second, passes through zero, where there's 0 volts. If you've latched onto that signal, your body, your muscles, your nerve system gets locked up on an electrical signal because your nerves are firing your muscles via electrical impulses. You're short circuiting out those impulses. When the signal goes through zero, your body can let go, the muscles can stop spasming, and it can prevent you from getting electrocuted by low voltage electricity. Low voltage electricity generally kills you by stopping your heart. On the other hand, DC voltages above about 50 volts can kill you because it never passes through zero. Your muscles can lock up, and you can enter a condition where you can't let go of the signal. And the electricity, if it's traveling through across your chest and to your heart, through your heart, it'll stop your heart. It's the way doctors start and stop hearts for medical procedures. But they do it in a controlled fashion. You're not. Yours can do serious damage. Counter to that is high voltage currents. At very, very high currents, so much power can pass through your body. And it's the total wattage that does the damage, not the voltage, not like some people think the current, but the total wattage. Well, at high voltage, very high voltages, immediate tissue damage occurs. You literally cook. So you don't want to play around with like a 3,000 or a 10,000 or a 100,000 volt line. Another rule of thumb I want you to remember. As a rule, I give you a honest statement here, and I'll go through this chart in a second. As a rule, electricity can jump through the air or arc. You should use a rule about 1 inch per 1,000 volts. Now, let's see what that means. Well, 440 voltage, about 500 volts, can jump about 1/2 inch. So a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch, depends upon the humidity and other characteristics at the time of right where you're at. All right. All right, this chart is fairly accurate. Generally, anything below 1 milliampere you can barely feel. 1 milliampere is a little tingle. 5 milliamperes, it's a little shock. You'll feel the shock, but it won't hurt you. Somewhere between about the average person about 6 to 30 milliamperes. They say men or women, but it has more to do with your physical mass, but not whether you're female or male. So I don't want to get into the pronoun thing here. Um, you'll feel that. That'll hurt you. That's in the range that is where um like oh stun guns and cattle prods are between 50 and 150 milliamperes. That's extremely painful. It can cause cardiac arrest. It will cause muscle contractions, and you can die around 100 to 150 milliamperes. We're not talking an amp. We're not talking half an amp. We're talking milliamps. Now, between 1,000 and 4,300 milliamperes, it talks about it can damage your heart. Uh, it will likely do serious damage, which will be permanent if you survive. And survival is not guaranteed there at all. But what isn't really discussed there is that's really about the point at which you can also have severe burns, and they can be inside your body, not just on the outside. But at about 10,000 milliamperes, you can just burst into flame type of thing. Get severe burns. Your heart will be stopped and probably permanently damaged. You are not likely going to survive that. Generally speaking, these currents aren't really obtainable through the human body in most ham gear, except for high-powered tube amplifiers, some of which have high enough voltages to push this much current through your body. And remember, it's total wattage it gets you. Um, I'm not going to get into too much about batteries, but I want to tell you that lead acid batteries, you want to be careful about how you store. From the standpoint when you're charging and discharging them, they give off gases. Those are hydrogen-based gases, and with sulfides, and it can be both a fire hazard and a health hazard. Lithium batteries, you want to be very careful on their storage. Never charge a lithium battery too cold, and keep that in mind. We discussed that the other day. Now, power supply hazards, there's one I really want to point out. When you turn off power supply, you'll often see that it takes a while for the meter to stop displaying. The on indicator, if it's an LED, will go off slowly. That's because there are filter capacitors and they're high voltage or high current, capacitors. And it takes a while for them to discharge. Not only that, but some capacitor banks can sit idle and literally draw a charge from the air. So, a hazard that exists with all power supplies is that you can get hit with latent voltage. Voltage is there long after the device is turned off. For that reason, when working on high-powered power supplies, certain types of tube circuits, it is important to ground them out to ground for your own protection. The rules of high voltage are here. One is to work with one hand in pocket, and when you're working on live circuits, only work with one hand, put the other one in your back pocket, is the old saying. It says to wear insulated shoes and, make sure you don't touch things in a way to give a path of current through the bulk of your body. I'm going to correct this. Number one, you don't know the insulative capacity of your shoes. Don't bet your life on it. Don't bet your life on the insulative rating of tools unless they're specifically designed for high voltage electrical testing. Don't use probes or testers that are homemade that aren't rated for voltages high enough that the insulation will protect you. And they got to be not what you think, but what is actually tested rated values. It's real easy to think that low power equipment won't hurt you. but I tell this story all the time. I had a reputation as an apprentice electrician as being the safest, most cautious electrician apprentice that ever was in the department I was first in. The electricians used to brag about how well I knew all electrical safety rules. Till one day I sat in the shop. I'd gone to a swapping shop the week before. I bought a kit to build a little tube laser. The power of the laser was a 9-volt circuit with a 9-volt battery. And the little tube had a circuit that created 5,000 volts DC. Unfortunately, in my putting together, I crossed the wire. When I went to test it, I got the 5,000 volts through me. Now, fortunately, there's very little current in that circuit, but 5,000 volts, as we discussed on the other uh, uh, or chart or page, it's painful. I was put down on the floor. It's just like being hit by a taser. Essentially, that's what it was. Forever and a day after that, the electricians commented, "This is the safest electrician in the world around high voltage, but don't give them a 9-volt battery." That happened because there were capacitors there holding that high value charge. And they discharged me through me in what's called the capacitive discharge circuit. It is the same, and is a circuit designed intentionally to discharge through things like flash tubes for an electronic flash. They're not designed to pass through you, except if it's a taser. And I don't recommend that you try getting tased by a taser. Keep in mind that shorted batteries can overheat, catch fire, explode. They can be extremely dangerous. So working with electricity, around any electricity, my advice to you is to do what every electrician does. Take off all rings, watches, necklaces, chains, any metal device, and remove them from your body. Rings and necklaces and bracelets and watches in the right conditions can actually absorb RF energy and burn you or even shock you. Keep that in mind without touching anything. Always avoid working around energized equipment. Again, you want to turn it off, ground it with safe grounding practices, and study up to do that. Google it or whatever. Don't try something you've never done before on your own. Get somebody to show you if you don't know. And remember that you're not fast enough to touch something like somebody who feels the side of a pot and lets go. If you touch something electrical that's high enough current, especially if it's DC, you can't let go to begin with. You can't move away from it. You're going to get in serious trouble. So, your book does vaguely cover all these subjects. And remember, your body has some certain resistance that limits how much current can go through it. Don't rely on it. I worked in a plating operation once, had 1,000,000-volt plating tanks. I'm sorry, 1,000,000-amp plating tapes at 12 volts. Yes, at 12 volts, you're not going to get electrocuted. So you could safely go up and touch the both sides of the plating plates. Wouldn't harm you because it was such low voltage. Should you do it as a rule? No. You can why? Because what happens when there's a spike that comes through that is way out of range? The current path is there for 1,000,000 volts. You aren't even going to be a crispy critter if 50 volts goes through that line. They aren't going to find much of you. So, likewise, you can touch high voltage circuits on one side if you're isolated from the other. But remember again, I told you about how far currents can arc. And so you brush close to something, that could be it for the rest of your moments. And you really, really, really never want to work on high voltages alone of any kind. You want somebody around who's not only there can take something like a 2x4, some wooden device to push you away from it, or preferably a fiberglass device rated for high power. But you want someone who's also capable of and has the training to administer CPR, first aid, and call 911 if things go wrong. Go back to my first rule. Try not to work on anything high voltage that's powered up. Make sure it's off, isolated from power, like unplugged or disconnected, and then grounded. Now, by the way, the ARRL book, handbook, has a great discussion on designing a workbench for safe practices. And it talks about how to build a current limiting AC and DC supply to protect you while you're testing. If you're going to do your own repairs and work on gear, get the ARRL handbook and read the um, chapter on setting up an RF or an electrical workbench. Bonding and grounding. I've already told you, buy this book, Bonding and Grounding book by the ARRL. It will be your best friend. Okay. On an electrical circuit in the house, there are 3 colored wires for a 110 circuit. One is black, that is the hot wire, that is carrying the current. The second one is the second one is white. That is the return ground path. That is the path to ground or through ground. And the third is a ground path called ground. It's green or bare. The ground wire differs from the neutral wire, the white wire, in this way. The white wire is intended to carry a current all the time, whenever something's running. The ground wire is not. Ground fault detection type circuits and so on detect when there's a voltage on that line. And that's what protects your life. So, no, you don't want to use the same wire out in the field, even though at the panel, it might be the same point, the ground for the ground and the neutral. They're the same point on the panel. The wiring coming to and from is there to protect you by being separate. Likewise, all grounds should tie together. They should be bonded together. And so all your electrical grounds, including your station grounds, your quote RF grounds, there really isn't a real RF ground. There is a ground to RF situations, but it should always be tied to common grounds. And that means that you don't need extra ground rods as a rule. You need everything to go to the ground rod at your house. If you put in extra ground rods, you must tie them to the same ground rods that are already at your house. And there's a rule in the National Electric Code, you can't put ground rods closer than about 5 feet away from each other. And you must follow that rule. There's a reason for it, but I'm not going to go into it here. The book does. So get that book for yourself for your own reference. On the AC circuit, generally you fuse the black wire, which is the hot lead. You may put a fuse on the white wire, which is the neutral, but you don't need to. The hot wire is the one that matters. Another thing I'm going to quickly tell you about safety is if you ever hook up a home generator to your house temporarily, disconnect the load, the main connection to the power coming in. If the power's out, you hook up your generator and you leave it all connected, there are 2 terrible things that can happen. One, you feed 110 volts back down that line. It goes through the transformer and becomes 13.8. And now the guys working on the line that's supposed to be turned off get electrocuted. You're going to jail. That's not ham radio. That's the law. 2, the power comes back on. You got your generator hooked up to it, and that power comes flying through on, and the power company hooks up, and it just destroys your generator and part of the wiring in your house to go with it. You have to disconnect the main, disconnect the power if you ever do that. Use 3. The rest of this is pretty self-explanatory. When you test power or any electricity, you need electrical test equipment designed for the voltage, for the power, for the type of testing. And they are rated for voltages and power. The average amateur radio piece of test equipment, well, the average multimeter, for example, is rated usually from 2 to 600 volts. I would not rely on a lot of them at 600 volts. If it's only rated for 200 volts, don't test 240 with it. They don't mean 240. It means 200 is enough so you could test 110. Those are usually designed to be lower voltage testers, like car battery testers and so on. Your book tells you not to overload circuits, not to put, wiring in your house and is rated for a certain current. For example, in household wiring, number 14 wire is generally rated for 15 amps. Number 12 wire for 20 amps. 30 amps is number 10 wire, and there's a chart you can find on the internet that will get you through even more of them. You exceed that, and the wire can overheat faster than a fuse will blow. In other words, if you took a 15 amp circuit in your home and you went and it was the fuses in there instead of circuit breakers, you replace the 15 amp fuse with a 30 amp fuse. Well, now you could draw 30 amp down that line and that wire would start to cook. It'd get hot, it'd get red hot, cherry hot. The insulation would melt away, and that's when the house burns down. Not a good idea. Okay, and your book describes the connectors and what connector is what. It's good to study, good to know for the test. And I'm going to skip past it. Okay, here's the chart that I described earlier. And you'll notice, hey, look at that. Number 14 is designed for 15. And you maximum current allowed on a breaker is 15 amps. So you notice there's a little subnote here because the code kind of realizes they're using the same plug for 15 and 20 amp circuits. But that doesn't mean you can get away with a 20 amp draw on a 15 amp circuit because the breaker is set for 15. So there is a difference between 15 amp and 20 amp receptacles. Generally in houses, all the receptacles are 20 amp. The 15 amp receptacle for 110 has a slot across the one side. Memory serves me correct. It's the right side, which would be, and they don't show you. It's a neutral. But and the 30 amp 110, well, there are multiple types of each of these. Generally, the same type of plug will have both of the blades going across, not up and down. But generally a 20 amp receptacle is used as the most common receptacle for both 20 amp and 15 amp circuits. It's actually a 15 amp receptacle. All right, a couple of things I'm going to go through real quick. There's some questions here at the bottom. I really want to discuss what the questions cover, not the question itself. So the first thing I'm going to discuss is, where should a lightning arrestor go? A lightning arrestor is a device that doesn't stop lightning from hitting your house. A lightning arrestor discharges charges in the area so that it makes it less likely lightning will strike your house. Never depend upon a lightning instructor as protection against a lightning strike. Depend upon it to reduce the odds. Now, lightning instructors are mandatory under Part 810 of the National Electric Code. And nowadays, feeding into your house just before the coax or feed line enters the house is where the lightning arrestor should be. It should be grounded to ground at the nearest point where the building itself's grounding point is. Usually right outside where the box is on the inside for your fuses or circuit breakers. All grounds should be kept as short as possible, as direct as possible, with as few of arcs or bends. If you have to bend around something or make a bend, they should be very broad, rounded bends. This is to ensure that if there is a lightning strike, it can travel to ground and not get trapped by the physics of the mechanics of the uh, electrical path. Next, all ground should be, and all ground rods, all earth connections should be bonded together. And so should every device in your shack. Everything in your system should be bonded, and we'll cover that in just a minute. When you, if you want to ground a tower or a mast, and you should ground them and tie that to ground at the same grounding point as your electrical ground and all the rest of the ground systems. Now, that may mean that you'll have to run a cable to it to ground it, and that may mean you need a big wire to get to it. National Electric Code sets the minimum at number 6 wire for ground wires. But if you're running 40, 50, 60, 80, or 100 feet, that's not a short connection. You're going to need some much bigger wire. The grounding book will tell you about that in detail. They won't ask you on the test. They'll just want you to know you should use bigger wire. I've already covered all this. Ground rods should all be tied together and all that. I'm going to tell you something that's very true. A lot of hams think if I just unplug everything, I'm good. I don't have to worry about lightning strikes. Lightning just traveled 5 miles through the air to get to your house, and you think it's going to stop because you pulled the plug? It's not. So I'm going to tell you, if lightning starts coming up, get off the air. Get away from that radio. Yes, it's nice to have systems that ground everything to ground, including your antennas, and that's the best way to do things. To have a throw switch or a means to mechanically ground it. If you want the ground to actually occur outside with a remote switch, if you really want it to be safest. And you want that ground to serve not to stop lightning from getting to your equipment or to your house, but rather you want it to dissipate the ionized charges that attract the lightning to begin with. Lightning is neither positive nor negative or AC or DC. In a way, it's kind of pulsating DC. But what happens is you get a static buildup on the ground, either positive or negative. You get a static buildup in the air, either positive or negative. Now, when you got that big charge static in the air, it wants to dissipate somewhere towards the ground. Well, the ground itself is at neutral. It's not necessarily all at the same voltage. We've discussed that before, but it's the neutral reference. On the other hand, up in the air, that static electricity is building bigger and bigger and bigger into millions of volts. Well, whether it's positive or negative doesn't matter. That lightning wants to find the highest point that's not grounded very well. Because the point that's not grounded very well has probably got the opposite charge. and current wants to charge from negative to positive. I'm sorry, conventional theory, positive, negative, but electrons flow from negative to positive. So if there's an excess of negative electrons up in the air, they're going to hit the closest object to them that are positively charged. If everything at your station is neutral, that's not the best point for it to go. Lightning seldom hits the ground. Now, if the opposite happens and the top of a tree is negatively charged and the sky becomes positive, lightning starts at the ground and shoots up. You can't see the difference with your naked eye. Lightning will then cause so many electrons to flow in whatever direction it's going. It will overshoot. Too many electrons will go through. So what was positive will become negative, and it will swing back and forth like a pendulum, going positive, negative, negative, positive, back and forth until it dissipates all the energy entirely. Now, this occurs in fractions of a second, but that's how it works. All right. Managing RF in your station, I'm going to tell you the easiest thing here is remember bonding everything. Next thing I want to tell you, bonding will protect everything. We'll cover a lot. There's questions we're going to get to in the text that will cover this tomorrow. So I'm rushing through this. The picture here in the book 9.2, a pretty good representation of a good way to bond everything together. And this should go right back to that grounding point where in the house at your main panel where it feeds from the outside. I covered interference. If grounding will help with interference. But if you have interference, I've already covered that filters will help you get rid of it. High pass filters will allow high frequency signals to go through, but block lower. Low pass filters will block high frequency signals, but high pass will pass the high and block the low. So pass is what it lets through, whether it's high or low. So that's how you can filter out unwanted RF. I talked about ferrite beads already in this class. I talked about harmonics and various spurious emissions already in this class. I want to jump ahead to a couple of things. One is RF exposure. The new rules and regulations from the ITU mandate this now. It's international treaty. We have to establish our stations in ways that limit the RF exposure of human beings to our transmitting antennas. Generally, on lower powers like 50 watts or less, just keeping an antenna a wavelength away from people will protect them. So in the case of a 2-meter antenna, you want it someplace 2 feet away from people. Now, if we're talking, though, a high-powered station of 1,500 watts, then you have to do things to protect yourself and to protect others. There are 2 levels of exposure of rating of exposures of RF. I've discussed them before. One is tissue damage caused by thermal heating, RF that's so great it actually heat the body, cause immediate tissue damage. And one is long-term exposure. That causes low-level absorption of RF signals that does very small and subtle tissue damages over time. The latter is the one that could cause cancers, and that's why we want to minimize exposures. Mind you, you're not really a great risk to cancer from being a ham, but you want to follow these rules to make sure of that. So there is a maximum permissible exposure for every frequency, and there are rules about it. You can there should be a chart. I don't know where it's at. Here it is. And the maximum exposable or permissible exposure for various frequencies. Well, There's a 6 minute and an 8 minute average power density. And it's on here how many milliwatts per centimeter at various frequencies. You will notice as the frequency goes up, you want to reduce exposure. You want less and less exposure to the body. Okay? Where you can have 100 milliwatts at the HF frequencies, when you get to above 1.2 or 1.5 gigahertz, 1500 megahertz, it's down to 5 milliwatts. That's not very much, guys. Now, the good part is when you put up an antenna, there may be 5 milliwatts or greater coming off that antenna, but even if it's significantly greater, distance is your best friend. RF, like all radiating signals and emissions, follow the inverse square rule. For every distance away, the signal widens out by a square of the distance. So if you moved away, if you were a foot away from your antenna and you moved another foot to make it 2, the signal would be reduced by 2 squared or 4 times, or 1/4 of the signal. So it doesn't take very far away to reduce the exposure. So generally speaking, you want to keep as low as possible by just keeping the antennas far from where people can get too close. And I don't think they show it here, but you can find programs online where you can plug in all the numbers, do the calculations. And nowadays we have to submit with the FCC on every new antenna installation just exactly how we've protected against being beyond minimum exposure. So not there, there it is. Now, in addition to exposure, you also have to keep track of something called, you have to factor in something called duty cycle or average and duty cycle. That also is covered very well in the book, and it plugs into the formula when you do the calculations online and submit it. And trust me, you really have to run a lot of power to not be able to do this very easily. So for most stations, it won't be a serious problem, but you will have to document it. You will have to fill out the form. And so this question, T0 C04, really sums up everything you need to know. It asks, what factors affect RF exposure of people near an amateur antenna? And the answers are frequency and power levels of the RF field, distance from the antenna to the person, and the radiating pattern of the antenna. In fact, it's all of those. And those are the things you can control. You know what frequency and power levels you're operating at. You can control the distance of the people, and because of the radiating pattern of the antenna, where it's going to be the strongest, you can make sure that people can't get into that zone, either by raising the antenna high enough or by putting it in a position where people aren't going to be able to approach or are likely to approach it. Okay, so I'm going to go back. And these threshold evaluations, they give you a good example of what what you have to avoid. This isn't 100% right on the money, but it gives you something to pay attention to. Why do we have some that are lower than others? Well, I got to tell you, some frequencies, human bodies are close to resonant or resonant elements of. We can be antenna elements ourselves. So, for example, probably the most dangerous frequencies in the world are the FM broadcast band because they're right around the same, their wavelength is about 6 feet. The average human being is between 5.5 and 6 or 6.5 feet is a FM broadcast station. That is the reason FM broadcast antennas are up in the air. Oh, geez, 1,000 feet. That's why. Make sure you can't be close enough to be a resonant element. So follow the rules in the book about RF exposure. I can't improve on it. I don't like to comment on it too much because the book is really good and I don't want to make a mistake and give somebody a wrong impression. You must, though, fill out, I'm looking for the form. Okay. Now, when you're doing the calculations, it'll ask you for a duty cycle, okay, on the form. And if you refer to this chart, it's pretty accurate. Something like FM voice, any FM signal, any AM signal, and CW. If it's a key down tone, just the carrier, it's going to be 100%. Signals like RTTY, and that means that the transmitter is transmitting full power all the time. An AM broadcast signal always transmits a carrier. The carrier is a 100% duty cycle. It's always on. A single sideband signal would be somewhere between 20% and 40%, depending upon how the person's voice activity is. And you have to factor that in on your antennas for how you plan to use it. Generally speaking, I plug 100% into my calculation. But if you know you're never going to use AM, you're never going to use FM on a particular antenna, you can fall back to the duty cycles that best reflect the mode you're going to operate in. If you don't ever operate digital TV or RTTY, FSK, yeah, you might not have anything that utilizes 100% cycle. 100%. This cycle chart is also important to remember for what the draw is on a power supply, because it's also reflective of the average power and cooling ability that the power supply can generate. So, I covered this a bit. This is a single sideband signal and a Morse code signal. And this is looking at their waveform on an oscilloscope. Sideband is carried with the information you're talking. A Morse code signal goes on, goes off. It's not a perfectly flat signal, but this is why we have duty cycles. There's periods when there's no power in between or very little power as we're talking or sending. So antenna gain plays a big role in RF emissions, and it has to be factored in. So when you do the calculation, if your antenna has gain, you plug those numbers in as well, okay? So in doing an RF exposure evaluation, start with the average power for each transmitter and on each band. Use the same process discussed. Well, we don't need to just start with the average power. If you have long coaxial feed lines, you may want to subtract feed line losses. I don't. I just do the general calculation. Use the ARRL tables, or you can use the calculating automatic calculating online whatever you call them. You fill in the blanks, and it'll do the calculators. That's what it is, online calculator. Finally, use table to determine the distance required from the antenna to comply with the PE or MPE limits. And when you do, you want to, again, you have to file that. There's a form online. You do it on the FCC website, and you're done. You don't have to do it again unless you change antennas. Now, safety, putting up antennas. Antennas go up to heights. And if you're going to put your own antennas up and not pay professionals, number one, get the proper training for working at heights, use the proper safety equipment, okay? And follow manufacturer's instructions on how to put up structures like towers or masts. Don't guess. Here's a rule I want you to never forget. Use structural materials. A lot of hams think that conduit and fence, uh, yard fence rail or tubing is good for holding up antennas. It's not structural. Conduit is designed to be bent by human hands. We bend conduits as electricians all the time by hand with a hand bender up to 4-inch diameter conduit. Takes some real muscle to do 4. 2 is not unusual. So remember that. You're putting up something that will bend eventually, or likely bend. It's likely to come down and creates a hazard. If you climb the heights, make sure that you have the proper training. If you use man lifts of any type, again, get the proper training and the proper PPE, proper personal protection equipment. And in today's world, that's not a safety belt and a lanyard. It's a very special type of controlled brake safety belt or lanyard and a safety harness. And you must know how to wear that harness, because if you fall wearing them wrong, you will break your back if you survive. So,
or sing at a very high level.
that, well, it won't matter if you fall with it improper. It will snap your back, and you might be swinging there until they get you down, but you might never walk away. Avoid running any antennas that cross power lines. Avoid anchoring the trees that have power lines going through them. That should be common sense. You'd be surprised how many people don't know this. I've already talked about what you need to climb a tower. You need to have the experience and the training. I don't give it to you in detail, but it's not as I can just get a lineman's belt and climb it. There are very special hardware for climbing, and it's expensive. It's not cheap. My advice is, if you don't know what it is, pay a professional. He's worth not losing your life. They'll come out with the right equipment. Another thing I want to talk about is crank up antennas and antenna elevators. They make antenna elevators that will go up and down. You crank them up, and they make they make towers that can fold over or crank up. Climbing them is not safe almost ever. Okay. Never rely on that. If you have an elevator on a tower, that's got to be lowered before you go up to work on it. I got one right now that's stuck on a tower and has been for a while. I can't fix it because it's stuck up at the top. Can't climb up there and get it. I'm going to have to go with a man lift and go up and work on it. I'll probably do that this next fall. So don't play around with your life. It shows the safety harness in your book, but I will tell you right now, there's a D hook in the back. That is the point at which you should be hooked to. This lanyard right here is your safety lanyard. These hookups in the front are convenient hookups just to put your safety lanyard the other end temporarily. They are not for using to hook up or even climb with. And there's a special type of hooks. Again, they hook to the back there, and they're called gorilla clips. And you use them to hook one up and then climb and then hook the other one up till you get to the top of the tower. This requires training, guys. Don't take it upon yourself. Okay. Now, the rest of the book talks about how to use things like a gym pole and everything else. Again, read the book up. It's good to know, but you should have the right training. If you have the right training, you'll know things like you never climb alone. You need about 3 people on average to do a tower climb. And you really have to be in pretty decent condition health-wise. And it's not for your life is not worth amateur radio is not worth your life.